Tonight is a shir on a very fascinating and interesting topic. The topic that I'm going to speak about tonight is the entire Sefer Beresheit, according to its pnimius, which means its mystical understanding. That's a rather challenging endeavor. However, I hope to cover a lot of the Beresheit. But the interesting thing about it is to look at Beresheit in a completely different way. In fact, it's astounding that the exact same narrative that the Torah uses to describe the upper story is the same narrative that is used to describe the hidden story. And that's really what I want to talk about tonight, is the hidden story of Beresheit. What I'm going to do is take a look. I assume everybody here is familiar with Beresheit, at least on the story level, all the different stories. What I'm going to try to do is go through Beresheit and ask different questions. And then I'm going to go back and try to answer them. And in certain ways, that's a certain kind of dramatic effect. And we'll see that it's really very difficult to understand, even on a surface level, the Chumash itself. That Chumash is a very difficult limud, which means study in and of itself. Let's take a look. First question I want to ask, who was Adam Harishon? We know that the Medrash says that God made an agreement with the creation, and he said that if Yisrael would receive the Torah, would accept the Torah, mutav, it's good. If they don't accept the Torah, then the Rosh will restore the world to what is called Tohu V'Voyu. If that's the case, why is it that Yisrael appears 2,000 years after the creation? Avraham Avinu was 52 years old when the world turned 2000, and it was around that time that God made an agreement with him. He was the first Jew. So if the purpose of creation fundamentally is that the Jew should accept the Torah, how do we understand the fact that Avraham Avinu came 2,000 years after creation? Not only that, but if we ask ourselves, when was the Torah given? The Torah was given 2,448 years after creation. Just think of it. Imagine the entire world has to last, according to the Gemara, 6,000 years. We are now in 5,760. So could you imagine that more than 1/3 of the world's time passed before the Rebbeinu Shalom gave the Torah? How do we understand this? It's amazing. So that's the first question. Who is Adam? And if it has to be because of Israel, why would they receive the Torah 2,448 years later? And why would the first Jew appear 2,000 years later? Okay, let's go further. Now there's a great deal which obviously I have to leave out. I think it would be fascinating to have an entire series of the Beresheit at a different level of understanding. However, what I'm doing basically is what's called an overview of that story. Next thing I'd like to deal with is the concept of Cain and Hevel. Cain and Hevel, of course, are the two children of Adam and Chava. And in Russian, we have a unique story where Cain kills Hevel and so on. What is the understanding really of that story? Not only that, we have the concepts of Noach, where the generation, of course, was killed by the flood. How do we understand the story of Noach and the concept of a flood? Then we have what's called a very interesting segment in the Chumash, where the Moshe approaches Avraham Avinu and tells him that I want to make a deal with you. I want to make an agreement with you. It's called the Bris Ben Absarim, the covenant between the pieces, which is fundamentally an agreement that the Moshe makes with Avraham Avinu. The question is, why is he making an agreement with a person? What is the nature of this agreement? What does it signify? And what does it mean that that all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you? What does all this mean, and what is really going on? And not only that, what is the relationship between all the other nations and the Jews and God? Then as we see further, we begin to see that it's not only Avram, but Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. 3 avos. And we know, of course, they all had wives. There was Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. So the question then is, what is the meaning of 3 avos? Why are there 3 avos? What does that mean? The concept of 3 avos. Then another question we can ask is, how many oimos are there? How many matriarchs are there? And the answer, of course, is that there are 4. Well, something seems to be very uneven here. We have 3 avos, we have 4 imos. Why do we have that? What's the meaning of that? And why would Yaakov marry 2 people? He had more than two wives actually, but his wives consisted of course, Rachel and Leah. Why would Yaakov marry Rachel and another woman, Leah? Why are there 4 imos and 3 ovos? What's the meaning of that? Not only that, we begin to look at a segment of a story, the story of Yaakov and Esau. And that kind of a story, really, I want to go into much more detail. Because it's a fascinating story and it's very difficult to understand. Esau, of course, is born. Rivka has, of course, Yaakov and Esau. And the truth is, if you look at the story of Yaakov and Esau, it is very difficult to understand this story. Let's begin to understand and see how difficult it really is. Rivka has 2 children, Yaakov and Esau. And the Torah tells us that even before they're born, they're fighting. They're fighting in the uterus. What are they fighting about? Esau wants to get out and worship idols. And Yaakov wants to get out and learn in the Beis Medrash. Did you ever hear embryos fighting in the uterus to worship idols and to learn in the Beis Medrash? What does this mean? We're talking about real people here. This isn't Fantasyland or Disney World. We're talking about 2 people, Yaakov and Esau, and the Torah tells us that Esau wants to get out of the rechem, whatever, and he wants to worship idols. Do you imagine an embryo wants to worship idols? We know Esau is precocious, but this is absurd. The question is, where does this embryo, this infant, it's not even an infant, it's really an embryo, who's Esau, where does he get his drive from? Why is he so driven? That's the first question. Not only that, if Esau, as an embryo, which itself is incredible, wants to be Oved Avodah Zarah, he's not even born yet, the question is, what free will does he have? Could you imagine somebody is a Russia as an embryo? Then what free will can this person possibly have? And if he doesn't have any free will, why do they call him a Russia? Why is he called Esau a Russia? How could you understand that an embryo wants to worship idols before he's born? What kind of bechira does he have? And how do you call him a Russia? It's not a Russia. It's a Nebuch. It's an Onus. That's what he is. But the Torah clearly calls him Esau a Russia. How do we understand this? Even on simple terms. Then the Torah tells us that they're twins. What do you mean they're twins? Yaakov and Esau are twins. And you clearly see that they were identical. Because later on, when Yaakov Avinu died and they took him to Eretz Yisrael to be buried in the Moras HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah, it said that Esau stopped the funeral procession because he wanted the place. Why should Yaakov have it? He wanted it. So there was an individual called Hushim ben Don, who was a mute, deaf mute, and he didn't hear what was going on. But he saw that this person, Esau, who he knew was his uncle, that he was stopping the entire procession. So Hushim ben Don didn't know anyone's called Chochmas. He didn't, whatever. He figured, how in the world could you stop a funeral procession of Yaakov and Esau? Of Yaakov. So what does he do? He took his sword and he wanted to cut off the head of Esau. So he looked at him and he couldn't cut off Esau's head from the front because it looked like his grandfather, Yaakov, because they were identical twins. So he went to the back and just cut off his head. And the head of Esau rolls into the Moras HaMachpelah, and the head of Esau, according to the Medrash, is buried with Yaakov Avinu. Could you imagine that? His body was out, but his head was with Yaakov Avinu, which really tells us a great deal. But in any case, so we see they were twins. So the question is, how could you have twins of such an incredibly different nature? This is a question. Now, another question. Yitzchak and Esau. It says that Yitzchak loved Esau, and Rivka loved Yaakov. Why? Why would Yitzchak love Esau more than Yaakov? How do we understand this? So we're talking about Yitzchak, he's an Ov. He's an incredible patriarch. How is it possible that Yitzchak loves Esau more than Yaakov? And not only that, but we know, of course, that Esau fooled Yitzchak. So didn't Yitzchak see through this? I mean, where was he? Where was Yitzchak vis-a-vis his son? So that's a question. Not only that, the Torah describes them very interesting, where it calls Esau an ish sadeh, a man of the field, and Yaakov it calls Yoshiv Holam, a dweller of tents. What is the Torah doing? Is it describing some kind of tendency of these Yaakov and Esau in terms of what it would like to do? Or is it something else that Torah is telling us in terms of its pneumius? Then we come to the story that they're both 13 years old, Actually, they're 15 years old. And on that day, Yaakov Avinu Yitzchak was sitting Shiva because Avram Avinu died on that day. So Yaakov is Yitzchak is sitting Shiva. And Yaakov is preparing a meal, it's called the Sudas Avro. It's a meal for the mourners, which Yitzchak was a mourner. In comes Esav, and he's famished. He's hungry, right? Comes and sits down, and Yaakov Avinu immediately sees an incredible opportunity. He is going to take the birthright, the firstborn birthright of Esav for himself. And that's exactly what he does. He says, do you want beans or you want the lentils? Fine, I'll give it to you, but let's make a deal. I want your birthright, right? And what was the birthright? What the birthright is that in those days in the family of any family, the spiritual rights toward the family, what's called the priesthood, went to the Bechor, went to the firstborn. So in essence, what Yaakov wanted is he wanted to buy the birthright, the spiritual responsibilities of the family. So he made a deal with him. He said, you want it? Birthright for beans. So Esav says, fine, no problem. Esav couldn't care less. But the incredible thing is, what is this? Did you ever hear of a brother making a deal with another brother when he's starving? Not only that, Yaakov Avinu is Yaakov Avinu. I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking to the greatest of the others, correct? The greatest of the others. Where's the chesed of Yaakov? Would anybody here have made a deal with his brother or sister and said, you want something to eat? Pay. Where's the chesed of Yaakov? Why did he do it? And it's very strange, the lashon of Yaakov, because Yaakov says, Michro kayoim, sell me as this day, as b'chiroscho, your birthright to me. What's mean sell me as this day? Sell me your birthright. What means sell me today your birthright? What is this? What's going on here? That's the question. Then we jump to the story, of course, of the great deception, where Yaakov wants the brachas, so Rivka puts up Yaakov, of course, to deceive Yitzchak. And they put on a whole lambskin or whatever it is. And of course, Yaakov comes in front of Yitzchak. And Yitzchak, of course, is blind and he doesn't see. And Yaakov, of course, takes the brachas. The question is, what's going on here? What's this rush to get the brachas? Why should Yaakov go so far as to deceive his father in order to get the blessings that Yitzchak wanted to give? What's the urgency here? This is the question. And not only that, this urgency demanded deception. Why did you have to really have the concept of deception? And not only that, when you take a look at the brachas, you see clearly that the blessings that Yitzchak wanted to give Esav, because that's who he thought he was giving it to, are material blessings, where you will eat from the fat of the land. It's basically material blessings. It's not spiritual blessings. So what's the rush here for the blessings, for the brachas? This is the question. Also, we find that later on, when Yaakov leaves, and in comes Yitzchak, in comes Esav, and Esav says, Yitzchak says to Esav, who are you? Because he asked him for blessings. He says, who are you? I just gave them. Supposedly to who? To Esav, who of course was Yaakov. So of course Esav says, what do you mean? And he starts crying. So it says that when Yitzchak realized who he really gave the blessings to, it says, Vayechlat Yitzchak charod gedoilo ad me'oid. He shook with an unbelievable fear. This is what it says. I want to ask you something. If somebody just made a fool out of you, right? He just deceived you, right? What's the correct emotion that you would have? What would you be? Would you be frightened? No. You'd be incredibly angry. Because you'd just been made a fool of. Somebody came in and took your blessings. And that you wanted to give. It's incredible. This is keep it over aim. What is this? But it doesn't say that's what Yitzchak's emotion was. The emotion of Yitzchak was unbelievable fear. It says, Charod gedoilo, a great fear, ad me'oid, which means unbelievable. Why? Why wasn't Yitzchak fuming at Yaakov? Completely inappropriate emotion. So that's very difficult to understand. Then it says that Yaakov, it says, Vayetze Yaakov mi Beresheit vayelech Haran, which means that he went out from Beersheba, where Yitzchak lived, and of course he went to Haran. So because of what's called the juxtaposition of the two psukim, the slichus, so we learn that why did Yaakov go to Haran? Because of what happened in Beersheba. What happened in Beersheba that he went to Haran? Is it because he was afraid that Esav would kill him? and therefore Rivka told him? Is it because he wanted to get a shidduch? Is that why? Or is there some other idea of why he went to Haran? Then it says that on the way to Haran, he had a dream. What's the dream? He sees a ladder, a sulam, and he sees angels going up and down this ladder. What's this up and down the ladder? What does it signify really? Then what happens? Yaakov, of course, goes to the well and he meets Rachel, of course, and then he winds up ultimately marrying Rachel and Leah, which of course is unbelievable. Why does Yaakov have to marry Rachel and Leah? Is it because it just happens to be that he marries, of course he wanted Rachel, but since Leah was of course distraught at the fact that she was going to be alone and Rachel was going to marry Yaakov, so therefore it came out, of course, that he married Leah because actually Rachel was part of the conspiracy as to why he even married Leah. But why would he have to marry two women? This is the question. And really it's really emphasized by the question before as to the concept of why is it that Rachel and Leah, why are there 4 Imors and there are only 3 patriarchs? This is the question. Fine. Then it says, a significant moment, that Leah had Yehuda, and of course Rachel gave birth to Yosef. It seems to be a very important idea in the Torah. And she says, Oidis Hashem, I praise God, forgive me, of course. And Rachel says, of course, by Yosef, that God should give me another son, and so on. How do we understand the importance of Yosef and Yehuda being born? Then what do we have? It says that Yaakov, when Yosef was born, he goes over to Lavan and says, I want to get out of here. It says, Vayhi ka'asher, when Yaakov saw that Yosef was born, he goes over to Lavan and says, okay, I'm out of here. Now let's sit down and figure out how much you owe me. What does it have to do with Yosef being born or not? If Yaakov wants to leave after 20 years, or whatever, 22 years, so you leave. And so you leave. What does it have to do with the fact that Yosef was born? Because the Torah clearly makes the fact that you want to leave clearly dependent on the fact that Yosef was born. Why? Then what does Yaakov do? He leaves. And it says that Yaakov sends Malachim to Esav, of course, to find out what the story is, because Esav is coming to greet him. Finds out Esav wants to kill him. So Yaakov offers a very compelling argument. He says, Yeshli Shovach, I've got oxen and I've got donkeys, right? And I have tzon and so on. I have a lot of possessions. Fine. Then he says, Im Loven Gati. I lived with Loven, right? And so on. So Chazal have a drush on that. Im Loven Gati. I lived with Loven. Gati is the exact same letters as Taryag, 613. Unscrambled and it's Taryag. So what Yaakov was really saying to Esav is, I lived with Lavan and I observed the 613 mitzvahs. Now isn't that incredible? What kind of an argument? You think Esav cares if Yaakov Avinu observed the 613 mitzvahs? He couldn't care less. What was the argument that Yaakov presented to Esav that would somehow protect Yaakov? He doesn't care if he observed his mitzvahs. Esav is a terrible person. He's a Moedik Russia. What does he care for? Then we find that Yaakov fights the Malach. He fights an angel. What is this? I mean, it's an incredible story. A man fights an angel, goes back to get his vessels, and then he fights the angel. First of all, what's Yaakov Avinu fighting in a Malach? You don't find that anywhere that a man is fighting with a Malach. Second of all, a man can't win against a Malach. You talk about an awesome spiritual being. And not only that, but the Malach that he was fighting is Esav's Malach, the Satan. Rashi says that this Malach is Sarah Shel Esav, right? Who is the guardian angel of Esav? The answer is the Satan himself. Yaakov is fighting the Satan? That's impossible. And not only that, why is the Satan the Malach of Esav? The Satan isn't anybody's guardian angel. He's the chief of the evil empire. Why is he the guardian angel of Esav? It should have been some lower Malach. So that's the question. Then what does he do? He meets Esav. Now, we know Esav was coming to kill him. But instead of killing him, Esav gives him a kiss. And according to Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, that was a genuine kiss. Does that sound like he was trying to kill him? Why did Esav change his mind? And not only that, but Esav says to Yaakov, A very strange expression. He says, Yehi lecha asher loch. Let that which is yours be yours. So Rashi says, what does that mean? So Esau said, let the blessings which you stole from me by deceiving Yitzchak, my father, it's yours. I admit they're yours. Why would Esau do that? It's incredible. Guy's coming to kill him. So he first kisses the man, and then he says it's your blessings. What happened to Esau? He went crazy. What's going on here? It's contradictory to the whole purpose of what he was coming with 400 men. What does it all mean? Then we come to one of the most difficult questions ever asked in the Chumash. If you want to know what kind of question that is, here it is. And the truth is, I don't think anybody really has an answer. The Baalei Musa try to give an answer, but it's not a real answer. It's not a pshat. It's a Musa answer. The question is this. Dinah. Yaakov is about to meet Esau. Now, he doesn't want Esau to marry Dinah. He's going to take a look at Dinah and say, hey, I want that for my wife. So what does Yaakov do? Yaakov hides her into a chest. Puts her into a chest. So he hides her from Esau. Esau, of course, does not see her because she's concealed. Then Yaakov speaks to Esau, and then Esau ultimately, halach l'darkei, he goes his way. So a baskol, a divine voice comes out and says this, how could you have hid your daughter Dinah from Esau? How could you do this? You should have let Dinah be there, and maybe, who knows, Esau would have married Dinah. So the Baruch Shem says, you didn't want to give it to Dinah, she'll go to Shechem. Shechem will take her forcibly. Now let me ask you something. Imagine, you're going to meet John Gotti before he went to prison. John Gotti is the godfather of the mafia, right? And all of a sudden you have a very good daughter. And you're going to meet this guy for whatever reason. And for whatever reason, you're coming with your daughter. Now let me ask something. You don't want John Gotti to marry your daughter, correct? Certainly not. You don't want a mafia person to marry your daughter. So you decide to do what? You take your daughter and you hide her, right? Now let me ask something. Would anybody have any kindness to you? Would anybody say, how dare you hide her from John Gotti? Let him marry the mafia, what's called the tutti, the capi tutti, whatever. Let him marry the godfather. Would anybody have a tiny to you? Of course not. So what does it mean that the Rebbe Shem had a tiny to Yaakov? It's not to be believed. Esav is a Rasha Marusha. I don't even want to go into the sins that he used to like to take. One of his favorite sins was to take other men's wives and have relations with them. It was a murdig Rasha. So the fact that Yaakov, who's a tzaddik, we have no comprehension, wants to conceal his daughter, and the Baruch Shem has kindness on Yaakov Avinu, on Yaakov, why he didn't give it to Esav? We don't even begin to understand that question. So the Baalei Musa try to answer it, and they say, no, of course, God didn't have kindness on Yaakov, why he didn't give it Dinah? Of course not. But what his kindness was that Yaakov didn't even feel bad that he couldn't even give it to Dinah. That's what the Baruch Shem had complaints at. But the truth is, that's not the Pshat. Pshat says clearly that Yaakov should have given Dinah to Esau. What is the answer to that? Fine. Then, after that, fine. Then we have the story of Yosef. And Yosef is an incredible story. It is one of the most difficult stories in Chumash to understand. And I would like to ask several questions in my quest for clarity. Yosef has dreams. What's the dreaming all about? I mean, fine, so Yosef dreams. That's nice. But these dreams are not just dreams. They are called egocentric dreams. They are dreams where Yosef is worshipped. He's bowed to by his brothers. Even by his father and mother he's bowed to. What kind of a dreams are this? That a man would have dreams which clearly indicate arrogance and what's called egocentricity, where he's the center of everything. He's even got Yaakov and his mother bound to him. What is this? What lies on Yosef's mind that he's having these dreams? Fine. Not only that, but it says that Yaakov, his brothers, of course, hated him for his dreams, because they looked at the man, and they probably thought, what kind of dreams are these? On the contrary, he's merely trying to assert supremacy over the brothers. But it says, Yaakov shoma es hadovo, that Yaakov watched or anticipated the matter. What's going on here? Yaakov clearly had a perception which is different than what the brothers had. What was it? Clearly Yaakov knew something that the brothers didn't. The question, of course, is, what is that Yaakov knew? Not only that, one of the most difficult questions to understand is, why would the brothers want to kill their own brother? For what? What did he do? This guy was 17 years old. 17-year-old person. That's all he was, Yosef, right? Okay, so he had some arrogant dreams. For that, you kill the guy, right? Fine. So he used to comb his hair. The Torah says he's nah. He was a nah. So the Torah says he used to comb his hair to look pretty. Fine. Masalsal Basira, whatever that means, right? Fine. So that's why you kill him. Okay, so he speaks Lashon Hara about you. So for that you kill him, right? What's going on here? What lies in the mind of the brothers that they think they're justified in killing Yosef? This is the question. Not only that, it says there are many strange things. It says that it says in the Torah that Yosef was a ben zikunim. He was a child of his late age. But Rashi learned ben zikunim, and that's the Medrash, that he was Yosef ben zikunim. Yosef was taught everything that Yaakov learned. You should know, before Yaakov went to Haran, before he went to Lavan, it says that he took off 14 years to go to yeshiva. Imagine. His mother sends him to go to Haran, right? And he takes off 14 years to go to yeshiva. And after 14 years, then he goes to Haran to fulfill his mother's request. What is this? Let me ask you something. Do you know how old Yaakov Avinu was when he left because of the situation of Esau? He was 63 years old. I'm sure that Yaakov Avinu learned yeshiva for 63 years. So all of a sudden he became a masmid, and he decided to learn another 14 years? What is this? And it also says that he taught everything he learned in the yeshiva of Shem Ve'ever, because that's where he went. He taught it to Yosef. But it doesn't say that he taught it to any of the other brothers. Why? That is the question. Not only that, obviously the greatest story about Yosef is this test of Potiph's wife. Here's a woman that wants to seduce Yosef. And of course Yosef withholds the temptation. He, of course, is goiver, and he overcomes the temptation. The Torah seems to give this an unusual amount of lines. What is this story of Yosef? Now, you'll tell me, well, wait a minute. I mean, that's tremendous. Here's a woman that tries, Potiph's wife, got him alone in the house because Potiphar went away, and she wants to seduce Yosef. Fine. Right? So that's a choshev zach. I mean, man withholds that kind of temptation. Fine. But I'll tell you something. This happens to many people. Don't kid yourself. If you work in Manhattan, right? The seduction's going on in Manhattan all the time. And there are many from Eden that are not tempted by this kind of seduction. So would we say that this is akin to Potiph's wife's seduction? Why does the Torah say such an incredible shvach on Yosef because of this Maisa? There's no question that it's sitkus. There's no doubt about that. But there seems to be an additional concept here of which we are not aware. Fine. Then, of course, it says that Yosef he interpreted the dreams to the baker and to the wine minister and so on. He interpreted their dreams. And, of course, Pharaoh had a dream, and then they said, we know a guy who interprets dreams. And, of course, Pharaoh called him, and Yosef, of course, became Grand Vizier as a result of dreams. Why? Can you imagine a person interprets a dream? Imagine the president of the United States. He has a dream, right? He has a dream, and some guy tells him, right, hey, I know a guy who interprets dreams. He's very good. So the president says, fine. So what does he do? Calls the guy, and he has a session, presidential session, right? And he interprets the dream, this whoever he was. And then the president says, I really like that. I love the way you interpret my dream. In fact, I like it so much, I'm going to make you vice president. Does that make sense? Okay, what do you do to a guy? You say, fine, what's your salary? What's your fee for this consultation? Right? He's a dream interpreter. But listen, this is a business. What's your fee? You don't make a guy vice president of the United States because he happened to interpret your dreams. Come on, of course not. What's going on here? What's wrong with Paroi? You don't think there are other people that were vying for the job? And because they couldn't interpret the dream, they couldn't become vice president? You have an idea what Egypt was in those days? Egypt was the greatest nation on earth. And the viceroy, the Sheni Lemelech, the Grand Vizier, he's the second most powerful man in the world. Why? Because he interpreted dreams. Listen, They're all fighting in the United States who's president now, right? Listen, let them go to a dream interpretation, and whoever does will win the presidency, whatever. Clearly, we don't understand what's going on here. Clearly, there's another story here, of which we don't understand. Question is, what is this story? Now, the Torah doesn't reveal it, seemingly so. It just gives us a story. But when you learn the story in its simple, reasonable way, it is very difficult to comprehend what is going on here. Now, I've given a certain amount of questions, whatever that is. The truth is, there are many, many more questions, But what I'd like to do is now begin the pursuit of the answer. Is it possible to have one answer that will answer all these questions? I think I've given over 40 questions. Is it possible that there's one answer that can answer everything beautifully? And the answer is yes. What kind of an answer can that be? The only kind of an answer that can answer that many questions without difficulty is an answer that's true. It's an answer that's the hidden story. And that's really what you have to go to get the answer. Fine. If that's the case, let's see if we can begin to understand what Beresheit is all about at a completely different level. How do we begin to understand all these questions? And let me tell you something, there are many more questions, many more. What we have to understand is a very important idea that, and only the Rabbi can do this, he can write a book that has different meanings in the same exact narrative. That's what the Rabbi did. The true understanding of the Torah is that the Torah is what's called a multi-level disclosure. On one level it discloses ideas, and that's a simple story. But then there's another level that discloses another story. And there's another level, and so on. There's almost an infinite amount of levels of disclosure or information that the Rebbe does. And that's really what the Torah is. The problem is that in order to go beyond the surface, one has to have certain keys or a certain framework in order to do that. That's an important beginning a group of ideas to know before we get into the answer of being able to look at the Torah at a different level. How do we begin to look at the Torah? Well, the first thing we have to know is the concept called the divine plan. I will go through that very rapidly, what the divine plan is. One, the Rebbe creates the entire universe for one reason only. And the answer why he created the universe is because of the concept called Hatova. He wants to create a human being and bestow an infinite state of goodness to that human. That's the only reason why the Rebbe created the Bria. That's it. It's very, really very simple. It says in the Torah, Lehit bi'achisecho. And that's why he created it. To bestow an infinite state of goodness on a human. Why does the Rebbe want to do that? What's the motive of the motive? And the answer is, it is unknown. The Rebbe has never revealed to man why he wants to create man in order to bestow goodness on him. So we only know the first level of motive. We do not know anything beyond that. Second, what will be this infinite state of goodness that the Rebbe will give this person? And the answer is the greatest goodness of all, which is a comprehension of the Rebbe himself. That the Rebbe will reveal to this person some aspect of the Rebbe himself, God himself, and in that disclosure that God reveals is the greatest pleasure that's comprehensible to a human being. Period. Without going into more of what that means and so on. Third idea, the Rebbe has to make a decision. Is he going to give it to a person for free, or does a person have to work for it? So what God decided, what the Rebbe decided, is that a person must work for this. Therefore, this tremendous toiv, hatova, goodness, that the Rebbe will give is not called a gift, it is called a reward, because it will only come in consequence to effort which is expended by the person. Fourth idea, fine. So therefore, the only way you will receive this goodness is if you do what? Is if you work. That's the decision, without going into why. But the question is, what does this person have to do to receive this reward? That's the question. So the Rebbe creates an avodah. He creates a task for man. What is the task? A beautiful understanding. A very interesting idea. He says, listen, what is the reward? The reward is me. Means a disclosure or experiencing God himself. Therefore, what the Beresheit does is he says, listen, I will keep it simple. I will conceal myself from man, and if man seeks me and finds me to the extent that he sought me and found me, that's exactly how much he will experience me. It means if you look after me, if you get involved in my life, I will get involved in your life. That's basically what the Beresheit said. Therefore, we see a very interesting thing. Since the experiencing of God is the reward, the way to get that experience is to seek God, is to understand that God is the absolute master of creation. To the extent that you believe this, to that extent, you will actually experience that which you believe. Therefore, the Beresheit says, you must bring me back into a creation which I will absent myself. So God leaves creation, in a certain manner of speaking, and he conceals his presence from a human being. He wants to conceal his presence from a human being, and he says, I want you to bring me back. The concept of bringing God back into creation is called tikkun. Tikkun means rectification, restoration, or repair. What God wants is this person to repair an existential flaw in the creation. What's the existential flaw? That the presence of God is lacking from the perspective of man. Therefore, man does not see the Ribono Shel Olam, which really means that he doesn't understand that the relationship between the universe or creation and God is that God is the source of all being, and the universe emanates from him. Man does not see this. And it is the purpose of man, of course, to see this, and therefore God truly re-enters creation. This is the concept called tikkun. Therefore, God says, you, man, must be masaken the creation. You must rectify creation and bring me back. Therefore, the purpose of man is to take the creation from a state of hester, concealment, to a state of gilui, revelation. This is man's task. How does a person do this? How do we bring God back? And the answer is, we do mitzvahs. We have to do a command that God issues to the man, and if you do the command, God comes back. And I'm not going to go into what's the mechanism behind the mitzvah that allows it to work this way. I'm putting that aside. Just what it is that the mitzvah, if you want to know what is the mitzvah really do, the answer is it does tikkun. What is tikkun? It brings God back into creation. That's what a mitzvah does. Period. So the task of man is tikkun. The employee, the device that he uses is called a mitzvah. Fine. This is fundamentally the divine plan. Now, what does God do? He creates a man. This man is called Adam Harishon. He doesn't create a Jew. He creates an Adam, a man. Why? Because the interesting thing about it, and now we begin to understand, God did not intend initially that the ones who would inherit the future world would be Jews. Not at all. It is mankind. God creates man. He gives him a mitzvah. Don't eat from that tree. And what the concept is that if you don't eat from the tree of good and evil, right, you will bring me back. So he creates Adam Rishon. Adam is a masaken. That means Adam has the spiritual powers to bring God back. But he has to observe the mitzvah. Who is Adam? He's not Jewish. And the answer is, he's not Jewish, which is true. But God didn't intend that the Jews bring God back. God wanted man to bring God back, you see. So therefore the first man was not Jewish. But Adam wasn't Jewish. Instead, what was Adam? Adam was a Yisrael. He was a Yisrael. Now you may say, wait a minute. How could somebody be a Yisrael and not be Jewish? And the answer is because there are two different concepts. The concept Yisrael, when it is applied to a person, means that he can masaken the Bria. He can rectify creation. Because he has a certain kind of soul that is connected to the upper worlds. And when he does a mitzvah, the shefa, or the divine presence, comes down. Therefore, that man is called the Yisrael. The unique ability of a man that can bring God back as a result of his actions is called the Yisrael. A Jew is somebody who is a descendant of Avraham Avinu. A Jew is a racial term. A Yisrael is a spiritual term. Two different concepts. Adam was a goy, if you want to look at it that way. He wasn't Jewish, but he was Israel. So that answers the question which I asked. That God did make an agreement with man, with the Yisrael. It doesn't say he made it with Jews. It says he made it with Yisrael. That if Yisrael accepts the Torah, good. If they don't, I restore the creation to what? To tohu vavohu, to chaos. Who was Israel? It wasn't Jews. It was Adam. He was Israel. So therefore, he put Adam, and he said, Adam, don't do the sin. Therefore, Adam was Israel, because he had the power of tikkun, to rectify creation, to bring God back as a result of the mitzvah. And of course, this was the initial setup of creation. Now you'll ask me, the second question I ask is, where was the Torah? Why was the Torah given? We see that Israel was not Avram in the beginning, it was Adam Harishon. But what about the Torah? Where was the Torah? Torah was given 2,448 years later. Is that true? Not true. What is the Torah really? And now we understand, based on what I said. The Torah is nothing more than a mitzvah which brings God back. But who says that the Torah has to have one mitzvah, or 613? The amount of device that you need to bring God back depends on the amount of what? The amount of how far God is away. For instance, if you want to dig a hole in the ground, you need a little shovel. You want to dig a foundation to a building, then you need a derrick, right? Depends on what you do. The device depends on the job. In Adam Harishon's time, the amount of concealment of the divine presence was very little. Because Adam saw God in an incomprehensible way. So all the Torah he needed was one mitzvah. That was the Torah. But since the amount of Gilui, revelation, was so incredible, you didn't need 613 commandments. You only needed one. It comes out that Adam was Israel, and the Torah was that one mitzvah. That's all it was. Because the device to bring God back was sufficient with only one mitzvah. That's it. Because the Gilui is awesome. Of course, what happened? Adam sinned. And therefore things changed. So then God turns to mankind and says, okay, you guys, the descendants of Adam, you people have to now bring me back, because the job continues. And of course, since man sinned, man increased a certain presence, which I will get to, which meant that you needed more mitzvahs to bring God back. So therefore you now have to have the seven mitzvahs as opposed to one. Now, there's something very important to understand once Adam sinned. What happened? I'm not going to go into the sin of Adam. I'm going to go into the consequences of the sin of Adam. Until Adam Rishon sinned, before he sinned, there was a very interesting relationship between Adam Rishon and this creature out there called the snake. A very interesting relationship. Who was the Nachash, the snake? The snake, in many ways, was the manifestation, in a certain form. He was the mouthpiece of the Satan. What does that mean? Because the Rebbe Shem knew that a person is not going to sin unless he's tempted. Therefore, he creates a being called the Satan, who is the tempter, the Yetzer Hara. The one who was the Yetzer Hara, of course, was the Nachash, the snake. Therefore, it is the job of the Yetzer Hara, the Nachash or the Satan, to tempt man to sin. But it's interesting. Before that sin, man had a unique relationship with the Satan. What does that mean? What happened is that the Satan or the Yetzer Hara was not in the body of Adam Harishon. Not at all. The Satan was as an individual, a creature outside the goof of Adam. You see. So therefore the Satan could not tempt man internally, which is what he does to us. He had to offer Adam Rishon an argument externally. And he offered him certain arguments without going into that. Therefore, the relationship between evil and man was that evil was not in the body of man, it was external to the body of man. Very important distinction. Not only that, but the area that man lived, his circumstances, was an area that had no evil in it. Therefore, there was no, as we will see, Adam was able to live forever. The Rebbe Shem turns to Adam before, of course, the snake, and he says to Adam, man, if you sin and eat from that tree, on that day you will die. What does it mean you will die? Is that a punishment? And the answer is no. It is not a punishment at all. What was it? What happened is the Rebbe Shem said, you see that guy, the snake? Don't listen to that individual. Don't buy his argument. If you don't buy it, what happens?
then that snake will go away, and what happens as a result? I will return. In other words, the task of Adam was called Hispashtis Kedusha, to restore the holiness of God into the universe. That was the task of Adam Rishon. That was the only task. The problem, the deficiency of the universe was that God was absent from creation, so the only job was to bring him back. Had Adam not listened to the Satan, the snake, then God would have re-ended creation. That would have been the tikkun. Adam Rishon would have been the Mashiach, and the world would be completely different. What did Adam do? Instead of doing that, not listening, Adam listened. So what he did is he changed the fabric of creation. What happened is that since he bought the argument of the Satan entered the physical universe into the body of man. Now, what does that mean? That means the Satan was given dominion over the physical body of man. What does that mean exactly? That means that since Adam gave credibility to the Satan, he believed him, so God said, Mida Keneged Mida. You gave him credibility, you gave him existence, so to speak. You're not going to have to live with him in the same goof. What does that mean? That means that the Satan now inhabits the physical body. But how? He's not there, but he inhabits it to a certain extension of himself called Zoyama. Zoya means pollution. It is through the Zoyama, or through the pollution, that he actually inhabits the physical body, and therefore the physical universe. How do we see this? Well, it's very interesting. When the Satan inhabits the physical universe, the nature of the physical universe changed. In what way? Before the sin, Adam lived forever because there was no Satan in his place, in his universe. After the sin, the Satan inhabits the physical universe, and therefore there's a change. There's a tremendous change in creation. What is that change? The Satan enters the physical universe, man becomes physical, and what happens? Death results. Why? What happens is, what is the nature of the Satan? The Satan is a destroyer. He's an evil being, and it is meant for him to tempt man. What is the nature of that which is evil? The definition of evil is that which negates, interferes with a being. It's a privation of some aspect of being. That's what an evil is. The Satan is interested in only one thing called churban, destruction. The Satan is a demolition expert. The only thing he knows is to destroy, because that's the concept of evil. When the Satan entered the universe, into the body of man, what happens? Then all of a sudden, man begins to die, because that's the concept of evil in the body of man. In fact, it's interesting that physics recognizes this concept, but of course they don't know its spiritual source, its spiritual understanding. Physics has a second law of thermodynamics. It's called the law of entropy. What is entropy? Entropy says that given any energy system, energy will always diminish. Things always go downhill. They go from organization to chaos, if you ever notice, and so on. Things always break down. That's the concept of entropy. Who is responsible for taking something which is organized and in some way demolishing it, destroying it, degrading it, and so on? And the answer is, that is the influence of the Zoyama, of the Satan, into the Bria. So the law of entropy, which physics recognizes as a second law of thermodynamics, is the concept of the Zoyama, the Satan, his influence into creation. You can look at the Zoyama, actually, pollution, as a tentacle. It's like an octopus. He can reach very far away with a tentacle. The Satan, his connection with the physical universe is through the Zoyama. Fine. And in that, he inhabits the physical universe. Therefore, death ensues. So that's what the Beresheit said. If you sin, you're going to die. Why? Because you will have let the Satan into your residence. And since the Satan's essence is destruction, you will begin to be destroyed. You will deteriorate. You will decompose. You will die. And death is the ultimate destruction or a degradation. And so on. And that's really what the Beresheit said. What happened as a result? An incredible thing. We now have two ideas. We now have the fact that what? Adam Rishon now has two jobs. In the beginning, his job was merely to bring God back. But now that the Satan is here, first he's got to kick out the Satan and then bring God back. You know what it's like? It's like a guy who moved into a house, right? So what does he want to do? He wants to decorate. So what does he have to do first? First he's got to clean the house. You don't decorate. You don't put the design furniture all around if the former tenants have their old furniture. First you got to throw the old stuff out, and then you bring in the new stuff. Same concept. Before, Adam Rishon was in a beautiful house that was empty. His job was to bring God back. That's called Hispashtis Kedusha, which means the expansion or the proliferation of holiness. But after the sin, Adam changed what's called the fabric of the Bria. He introduced the Satan into his residence. So therefore the place became fashmutz, which means become filthy, with the zoyam of the Satan. Now Adam has a second job, or actually it's his first. First he's got to clean up. He becomes a garbage collector, and then he can bring the Rosham back. So therefore the second job of man became what's called Kfiyas Hara, to subdue evil on the holiness. So therefore Adam Rishon created two jobs because of his sin. There is now Kfiyas Hara, there is now the concept of removing evil. We've got to get the Zoyama out of the body. And the second job is to bring God back. But how do you do it? It's the same concept. If you withstand the temptations of the Satan, you weaken him. Now the question is, what does that mean? How do we throw the Satan out of the body? Right? He's an incredible malach. And the answer is a very important idea. The Rebbe Shem changed the relationship that man and the Satan have with each other. What does that mean? How does God create things? God sends forth an incredible force. It's called a divine force. It's called a shefa, a divine force. Now that force creates and maintains the existence of everything. Now, this is what it does. It's like everybody's connected to God through a cable. In fact, if God were to cut that cable, you would instantly annihilate, because there's nothing creating and maintaining your existence. Everybody's got to be hooked into the Rebbeinu Shalom, sort of like through a cable to exist. Fine. Now, the Satan was also connected to God through his own cable. Everybody has to be connected to God to receive this divine force. So what did the Rebbeinu Shalom do? Because Adam now has a new job, which means to get rid of the Satan Zoyma first, and then bring God back, the Rebbeinu Shalom walked over to the Satan, takes the cable of the Satan, and he cuts it. And the Satan, of course, is choking because he's not getting any Kedusha, takes the cable, and he hooks it into the cable of Adam Rishon. Do you believe this? And not only that, but there's a certain amount of Kedusha that comes down that can only go to one side, and that's it. Which means that the relationship between both sides is what's called survival. Because there's only enough Kedusha that comes down that only one side can survive. The question is, what determines the flow? And the answer is the acts of Adam Rishon. If Adam does a mitzvah, then he gets the shefa. He gets this divine force. What happens to the Satan? The Satan grows weak, and he has to walk on crutches. If Adam does more mitzvahs, then the Satan grows weaker, and ultimately you can kill the Satan by doing mitzvahs because it denies him the flow of holiness. What happens if Adam does a sin? Then the flow goes toward the Satan, and Adam begins to change. But the Satan grows incredibly powerful. What is the power of the Satan? The power of the Satan is that his Zoyama intensifies in the physical body. So therefore, the way to get rid of the Zoyama, the tentacle that the Satan has over the physical universe, and therefore the way to get rid of the strength of the Satan is by depriving him of his meal. And his meal is Adam Rishon's holiness. This is called the unique of the Satan. That the Satan is unique. The Satan nourishes off the Kedusha of Adam Rishon. Fine. Therefore Adam, he's a Masakin, he can bring God back, but even more so, because now he has to get rid of the Satan. So therefore what God did is he tied the ability of the Satan to survive to Adam Rishon, so it is possible for Adam Rishon to kill the Satan, literally, by denying him what's called this divine flow. Therefore it weakens the Zoyama, it weakens the hold that the Satan has on the physical universe, and ultimately the Satan dies. It's a very important relationship that man has with the Satan. Fine. So therefore Adam, we now understand, is Israel. He has the Torah, and he's now got to do two jobs of tikkun. There are two tikkunim. One is to reduce the Zoyama and to kill the Satan, and then to bring God back. Fine. Now, there's one more idea that we see. What is the meaning of Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David? Why are there two Messiahs? The Gemara tells us that there are two Mashiachs. There's Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David. What do you need two people for? And the answer is a very important idea, because the concept of Mashiach ben Yosef is a person that comes first, and he does battle with the Satan. There are two jobs that Adam Rishon created as a result of a sin. The cleanup campaign, right? And then the design of bringing God back. Therefore, there are two individuals assigned to these two tasks. The Mashiach ben Yosef is occupied in the concept called cleanup, removing the Zoyama, and the Mashiach ben David is the one who brings God back. Two different jobs, and therefore there is two different people. In other words, the sin of Adam created the necessity for a second Mashiach called the Mashiach ben Yosef. Fine. Now let us move to the Chumash. We now have enough information and framework where we can begin to understand. Who is the next people we encounter? Cain and Hevel. Why two people? And the answer is because we now see that what's the avodah of man? Two jobs. One is to remove the zoyama, right? To do battle with the Satan. To withstand the temptations of the Satan. That's one job. And the second job is to bring God back. All of a sudden we have Cain and Hevel. Why two? Because each one had that job. The job of Cain, the Rebbeinu Shem says, is an Oved Adama, a man who has to work the earth. What does that really mean? He's the one who has to withstand the temptations of the Satan and therefore destroy him. And that's why the Rebbeinu Shem says, the Rebbeinu Shem says to him that chatos, the Pesach chatos reveits, sin lies at the door, your door, right? And it wants to, and therefore, ve'ata timshel boy. But you can overcome this. What is the Rebbeinu Shem saying? He's saying that your job is to remove the zoyama. And that's over Adama, to work out the earth, to remove the pollution that the Satan has in it, and therefore to purify Gashmius without zoyama. And then Hevel's job is to bring back the flock, because he's a shepherd, to bring God back. That's really the meaning of these two people, because both of them had two different assignments. One was the union of what's called Ben Yosef, which is to fight the Satan and destroy him, and the other was the union of Ben David, which is to bring God back. Of course, what did Cain do? Cain wound up killing Hevel, which of course strengthened enormously the Satan. And then the Chumash continues. Remember what the essential cosmic battle is. Of course it exists in man. But the true battle is that the task of man in those days is to destroy the Satan by weakening him, by taking the holiness away from the Satan, reducing the amount of zoyama, destroying the Satan, and then God comes back into the Bria. Fine. Man seeks to do this for 2,000 years. What does that mean? That means that man should have done this. Because in the beginning, for 2,000 years, God said to Adam, I'm now going to give you a job to all mankind. All mankind was really Israel. And their job was to do the Sheva Mitzvahs. And had they done that, they would have weakened the Satan, destroyed him, and the version would have come back. They didn't do it. So first God destroyed them through the Mabul. And the second thing what he did is he spread them all over the planet. But the Rebbeinu saw that they are not going to do it, so the Rebbeinu decided that they are not going to do the tikkun. I'm going to make a deal, an agreement with the only one doing the tikkun. Who is that? Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu is the only one observing and listening to the Rebbeinu. Therefore, the Rebbeinu says, I am now going to give the concept of Yisrael to who? To Avram Avinu. Until now it was all mankind. But I'm going to take it away from mankind and give it to Avram Avinu. So the Rebbeinu makes a bris, a covenant with Avram Avinu, and he says, V'nivrachu b'cho kol mishbresu adama. The entire world will be blessed through you, because you are now the only one that can destroy the Satan and can bring me back. They cannot. Therefore, all blessings of the earth, because obviously if you destroy the Satan and you bring God back, that produces blessings. You're the only one that can do it. Therefore, the blessings of the entire earth is dependent on you, the only one that can do tikkun. So therefore, the job of tikkun was taken away from mankind and was given to Avram Avinu. And therefore, the job of repair of creation became a Jewish enterprise. It was now up to the Jewish nation to do this tikkun, and it was taken away from the Goyim. Fine. So Avram Avinu does the job, and then Yitzchak, and then Yaakov. What does it mean? Fine. There are certain what's called emanations, divine emanations. And each one of these people characterized certain emanations of God. Avram characterized the concept called chesed, kindness. Yitzchak characterized a certain divine flow called gvura, or strength, which means that he was able to withstand incredibly the temptations of the Yetzer Hara. And Yaakov Avinu was the middle, which means that he would exemplify both. Now let me ask you something. And we now begin to understand what happened. So therefore, the job of Tikkun goes to Avram Avinu. Now, what happens now? So Avram does his job, Yitzchak does his job, but all of a sudden, this middle concept really is given over to two people. I will tell you something which is very difficult to believe. The truth is, I had asked you a question. How many of us are there? And you answered 3. But then I asked you, how many Imors are there? And you answered 4, obviously. I will tell you something. There are 4 Imors, that's true. But do you know how many of us there really are? There's 4. That's right. God wanted 4 of us. Because the job to do the tikkun is really 4. Because the concept of a divine emanation called chesed is one person. The concept of another emanation called gvura is another person. But then there's a middle, and a middle, if you know, since it's a middle, has what's called 2 sides. The right side is Yaakov, and the left side is Esav. Esav is a patriarch. That's right. We now begin to understand something about Esav. Esav is an Ov. He is as great as Yaakov Avinu. That is why Esav was twins with Yaakov, because they were both in this middle section, Yaakov on the right and Esav on the left. This is the beginning of the understanding of who Esav was. Esav was supposed to be the 4th of. Therefore, this answers many, many questions. What does that mean? Let's see. The Torah really tells us this. The Torah says the following. What is the meaning of Esav? The concept of Yaakov is that Yaakov would be involved in what's called Hispashtis Kedusha. Actually, let me back up. Avram Avinu is involved with bringing holiness into creation. So he goes out and does what? And brings all kinds of gerim. Right? Gerim into his home. It says all the souls that Avram made. That's the concept of Hispashtis Kedusha, to bring holiness to throughout the entire world. Yitzchak does not go out to the entire world. Yitzchak stays home. He couldn't even leave Israel because Yitzchak was involved with what? Fighting the Satan. So he's involved in the second job of Tikkun. Now, the next 2 people are also involved. Yaakov is involved with Kedusha, therefore the Torah says he's Yoshev Yeholam, he's a man that dwells in tents, and Esav is involved in subduing evil. Esav's job was to go out into the world, withstand the temptations of the Satan, and therefore he's called an Ish Sodeh. Now, you should know, had Esav done his job, he would have been as great as Yaakov Avinu. In fact, the Paneach Rozo, who's a commentator on the Chumash, says that the gematria of Esav is twice the Yaakov. Therefore, Esav, had he done his job as an Ov, had he become an Ov, would have been twice as great as Yaakov Avinu. In fact, the Medrash says that had Esav not sinned, Yaakov would have had 6 Shvatim, and Esav would have had 6 Shvatim. And obviously, he has to be an Ov. So Esav is really an Ov, and that's why he's twins. Because him and Yaakov are both from the same concept called the center, Tferes. Yaakov is on the right side, Esav is on the left side. And therefore they're twins. Now, what was the job of Esav? Since Esav was a patriarch, what the Rebbe Shem did is he took the neshama of Esav, which was an unbelievable neshama, and he connected it with the root of evil. Because the neshama of a patriarch is a root soul. It is an incredibly great neshama that is a root to other souls. So he took Esav, who is a root soul, because he's an Ov, and he connects it to the root of evil, which is the Satan himself. So Esav had the ability to destroy the Satan at a fundamental level. In other words, Esav was connected to the Satan. Now, if that's the case, we begin to understand something. That the Yetzer Hara of Esav wasn't the regular Yetzer Hara that we have. The Yetzer Hara of Esav was the Satan himself, which would have meant that he had completely abnormal drives. Therefore, Esav is born in what way? we read all of a sudden that what does Esav do? Esav is involved in what? As an embryo trying to over the Torah. What does this mean? And the answer is because the Yetzer Hara of Esav was satanic, was literally satanic, and the Torah shows you that even as an embryo, Esav is connected to the Satan, therefore the drive of Esav as an embryo is abnormal. That's why Esav uniquely was the only one in creation really that had this drive. Because it was his job to subdue the Satan at a root level. Therefore his Yetzer Hara was the Satan himself, not merely one of his underlings. Therefore his drive was abnormal. So as an embryo, his drive was what? He had an incredible drive because he had to do battle with the Satan himself. Now you're going to ask me a question. Wait a minute. What kind of a free will did this man have? This guy's tied to the Yetzer Hara because the Moshe wants Esav as a patriarch to destroy the Satan. Correct? So then what kind of free will does Esav have? And the answer is, let's take a look. We don't realize, but Esav was an unbelievable, or he could have been an incredible tzaddik. Where do we see this? Let me ask something. Esav was a megalomaniac. He was an incredible bar-gaiva. Because we see that when he sold the Bechira, it says, Vayivas Esav es ha-Bechira. He despised the birthright. That's gaiva. It's arrogance. Let me ask something. For a person who's a very arrogant person, what is the most difficult mitzvah for that person to perform? And the answer is, any mitzvah which subjects you to authority. And that's the mitzvah of kibbud avim. Right? To honor your father and mother, really saying subjects you to the authority. But for a person who's incredibly arrogant, that's the most difficult mitzvah to observe. Because me listen to them? Yet it says in the Torah that Esav observed the mitzvah of kibbud avim greater than anybody. In fact, it says in the Gemara that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says on himself that I am the greatest man in my generation to observe the mitzvah of kibbud av. That's what he says on himself. But he says in the Gemara, but I find that my uncle Esav observed it greater than I. Can you imagine? In fact, you want to have an idea what kind of kibbud avim Esav had? I'll tell you. It says in the Medrash that when Esav went in to see his father and mother, or his father, it says he put on his big day Shabbos to see his father. Could you imagine the honor that he accorded to Yitzchak? So this same man that has the strength to deny his megalomania to his father and observe complete submission to his father, could you imagine the power of this person if he wants to do mitzvahs? That's why Esav had incredible bechira. Because to the extent that he was tied to the Satan, to destroy the Satan, he had unbelievable ability to destroy the Satan if he wanted to. Because he had the power of an Ov to do good. What did Esav do? Of course he didn't do good, he did evil, and for whatever reason he decided to go in the path of evil. That was his decision. But he could have easily destroyed the Satan. Because we see that from the concept of kibbud avim. In any case, this is what's happening. What then is the story of Esav? Esav, we understand why he has such a tremendous Yetzer Hara. We understand because his job as an Ov, a patriarch, is to destroy the Satan, and we understand why he's twins. What is really the story of Esav? Esav is the story of a patriarch, an Ov, that sinned, that blew it. It's the same thing. If you had looked, imagine if Avram Avinu decided to all of a sudden worship idols. Of course, we would be astonished, right? That's exactly what Esav did. Esav is a patriarch that could have been twice as great as Yaakov that blew it, which means he decided to go to Tarbas Raw. That's really the story of Esav. Now, this is the case. What happens? Now we begin to understand. First of all, we understand why Yitzchak loved Esav. Because the job of Yitzchak was to do battle with the Satan. As I said, Yitzchak's job was in the second job, which is to do the tikkun of the Zoyamah, to fight the Satan as much as possible, not to spread holiness around. That was Avram's job. It comes out that Esav was in the same job as Yitzchak. That's why Yitzchak loved Esav. Because he was a fellow worker. This is why Yitzchak had such a tremendous love for Esav. So what happens? Esav fails because he wants to fail. And it says that at 13 years old, he decided to throw off the yoke of mitzvahs and so on, but he didn't show anybody who he was. When he was 15 years old, he went out and in one day committed 5 terrible sins. Now the question is this, think about it. If a patriarch does a sin, it's not like we do a sin. If we sin, fine, okay. So we deny a certain amount of shefa to ourselves, holiness, and the Satan takes it. But could you imagine a patriarch sinning? Then the Satan has an unbelievable steak dinner, right? If we sin, the Satan only gets what? Peanuts as holiness. If Esav sins, right, he's got a 4-inch thick steak. Because a tzaddik's amount of awe is unbelievable. When a tzaddik does a mitzvah, he has incredible kavanas. So therefore, if an Ov sins, could you imagine the churban, the kilkul in creation as a result? And Esav sinned for 2 years. As an Ov, as the soul of an Ov, he's sinning. What was the churban he did in the Bria? I'll tell you. You know what Esav did? What was the kilkul of Esav? I will tell you. It says that Avraham Avinu died 5 years before his time. Because Avraham Avinu should have lived to 180. Instead, he lived to 175. Why did he die? Because he couldn't see what happened to Esav, that Esav, who was his grandson, went to tremendous evil. Let me ask you something. Do you know how many mitzvahs a tzaddik of the caliber of Avraham Avinu did every day? It's incredible. Do you know how much less of shefa, how much less of tikkun was accomplished because Avraham Avinu died 5 years before his time? An unbelievable amount. Why did Avraham Avinu die before his time? Because of Esav. So it comes out that the ultimate kilkul of Esav was the death of Avraham 5 years before his time, which denied the world an unbelievable amount of tikkun. This is what Esav did to the Bria. When you think about it, it's incredible. Now, what happens? Esav is 15 years old, and on one day, on the day that Avraham Avinu died, he goes and commits these terrible sins, 5 sins the Chazal say, without going into them. Now Yaakov Avinu, who is his brother and his twin, Esav comes in and he's famished. Now let's take a look at what Yaakov is. Yaakov looks at Esav, and because he's an incredible person, at 15 Yaakov wasn't normal. He was an unbelievable tzaddik. Yaakov Avinu at 15 takes a look at Esav and he says, it's incredible. You killed the Zayda. You killed Avraham Avinu. That's why he died today. So therefore Yaakov Avinu knew that he must take away the ability of Esav to do tikkun as an Ov. Because remember, if you could do tikkun, rectification, you could do kilkul, destruction. Whoever, that's because always side by side. So Yaakov Avinu said, I must take away the ability of Esav to do this kilkul. I must diminish him to take away his avahus, his ability as a patriarch to do tikkun, or else to destroy the entire creation. So Yaakov Avinu says to him, Michra, sell me kahayoim, as this day. It means this day, which is the day that Avraham Avinu died, we see what your kilkul did, that I must take it away from you. Therefore I will sell you beans, lentils, give it to me. So we ask, where's the chesed? We see immediately, Yaakov had to take away the ability of Esav to do the tikkun, therefore taking away the ability of Esav to do the kilkul. He had to take away this unbelievable neshama, or Esav would destroy the creation, because that's what an Ov can do. He can wipe out the creation. So he says, sell it to me. Buy. I want to buy it. That's what Yaakov Avinu really did, and it's merumas. It is alluded to in the word hayoim. Sell me this day, because on this day we see what you did. You killed our grandfather. I must take away your ability to do the tikkun, and therefore you can no longer do kilkul. I must remove you from the whole concept of the bris, the covenant, and remove you as an Ov. Esav couldn't care less, because he was way beyond that. He says, no problem. And he gives it to Yaakov Avinu. Fine. Time passes. So therefore Esav, of course, is gone. Time passes. Right? And what happens? The brachas. Yitzchak doesn't know this. That Esav sold it. And as far as Yitzchak is concerned, Esav is still involved in fighting Yetzer Hara. And he knows that if somebody fights Yetzer Hara, it's very easy to fall. That's why the fact that Esav was doing sins wasn't a chiddush to Yitzchak, because he knows that somebody who's got to go into the mud to fight the Satan, of course he's going to fall sometime. But he thought, as far as he's concerned, that Esav is still doing a good job, even though he sins every once in a while. So Yitzchak said, I want to give the blessings, the material blessings to Esau, because the material blessings belong to the one who's involved in the area of tikkun, of destroying evil, which is the union of Ben Yosef. And therefore the blessings are gashmis, they are material, where it says that you will rule over all the nations, you will have the fat of the land. In other words, you will take all the gashmis and you will channel it to kedusha. And that's the union of somebody who fights the concept of Yosef. Now, but Rivka knows that it's switched. And therefore she says to Yaakov, at all costs, you must get those brachas. Why? Because if Yitzchak blesses Esau, he will restore the ability of Esau to do the tikkun. He will restore his ability to destroy the creation. So at all costs, you must get it, even though we have to deceive your father. We begin to understand the incredible urgency here. Because had he gotten it, it would have restored his ability to do tikkun, which of course in his case means the ability to do kilkul. He would have been machrev, he would have destroyed the bria. And an Ov can do that. We can't, because we're too little. But a patriarch can wipe out creation. That's how much plugged in he is into the Uris, into the upper worlds. Therefore they go about this whole thing deceiving. Fine. Yitzchak Avinu, of course, gives the blessings to Yaakov, and he doesn't know it's Yaakov. He thinks it's Esau. Yaakov leaves. So the world is saved, right? Because what Yaakov prevented was the ability of the Esau to destroy creation. Now, in comes Esau and tells Yaakov, he tells Yitzchak, he says, I'm here. Who are you? I'm Esau. Where's my blessings? So the Torah says, and now you understand, Vayechrad Yitzchak, and Yitzchak shook. An unbelievable fear. I had asked the question. He should have been fuming mad. But no, he realized that if this is what happened, that Esau isn't somebody who's doing tikkun, he is a rasha and he's destroying creation. So Yitzchak realized that he almost restored the power of Esau to do kilkul, and had that happened, he would have destroyed who knows how much of creation. What would be the normal reaction? Unbelievable fear. That's why Yitzchak was afraid, because he realized he almost fell into the fact that Esau would be restored as a Ov. Fine. Now, if that's the case, what happens? You have three of us. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But there's a problem here, because somebody has to do the job of Esau. Listen, you may remove Esau, fine, because he blew it. But who's going to do his job? Because there's a side in the heavenly lights that must have somebody fighting the Satan, right? And that person has to go and do what Esau did. Esau went into the field. He was an Ish Sodeh. What's an Ish Sodeh? A man who goes into the field, he joins the world, he's tempted by the Satan, and he's still a tzaddik in what's called the klipa. He's still a tzaddik in unbelievable temptation. So if Esau failed, somebody else has to take up the slack. Who was that? The answer was Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov took up the slack. And this is what happened, was called a contingency plan. And the Moshe said, listen, you're going piggyback. Until now you did your job, fine. To spread holiness by learning Torah, now you got to do Esau's jobs. I need somebody to pitch in for me. So Yaakov took over the job of Esau, especially since he got the blessings of Esau. Yaakov takes over the job of Esau. So what does Yaakov have to do? Yaakov has to become an Ish Sodeh. He's got to go to the house of Lavan, which is a Moedik Russia, and he has to withstand the Satan. You see? So Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva Vayelech Harana. Why did he go to Haran? Not because he was supposed to get married, not because Esau was out to kill him, because now he had to become an Ish Sodeh. He had to take over the job of Esau. So he goes to the house of Lavan. So the Boshim shows him a ladder. Angels are going up and down. The Boshim was telling him there are two ways to be Oved. One is to go up, which means to spread holiness, and the other is to go down into the klipa, down into the mud of the Satan, and you've got to destroy the Satan. Your job was initially ascent. Now your job is descent. That's why he had the dream of angels going up and down. Fine. So he gets to Lavan. So since he now has a job of Yaakov, and now he's temporarily in Esau's corner, right? He's got to marry Esau's wife. future wife. Who is Leah supposed to marry? Esav. So he has to marry Leah because the wife of a person is mesugel to the avodah of whatever you do. And since Leah was the co-wife or partner in that avodah of destroying the Satan, right? She was unique to Esav. Since he took over Esav's job, he had to marry her. You see? You get a new job, you get a new wife. In any case, we now understand why there are 4 matriarchs and only 3 patriarchs. Because Leah should have married Esau, who was an Ov. But since Yaakov took over her job, therefore Leah had to marry Yaakov. And that the whole thing came about to a kanunya, to a whatever and so on, in order for Yaakov to marry Esau's wife. Because he now had a spiritual endeavor of Esau. You've got to marry his wife. Fine. Now, but Yaakov Avinu cannot do this job very long. I mean, how long can you do Esav's job? Because Esav had a job of fighting the Satan. Therefore, the Satan to Esav was what? Was Taiva. Yaakov's Yetzirah wasn't Taiva. It was what's called Anivas or Gaiva. Because Yaakov Avinu had to contend with arrogance or humility and so on. Whereas Esav's specific kind of Satan was really in the area of Taiva. So Yaakov Avinu couldn't do it all the time. So at a certain point of time, Yaakov would have to drop the job of Esau. When does he drop the job of Esau? How can he do it? There's got to be somebody else. Because Yaakov Avinu only did half the job of Esau. What about the other half? So the Rosh did an incredible thing, another contingency. He had to take a shevet, a tribe, and elevate him to be the status of half an Ov, Chatzi Ov. So this individual has to have the neshama of an Ov, so he can take over half the job of Esav, and the other half is a shevet. Who is the only one that could do that? Is Yosef. The secret of Yosef is that Yosef took over the second half of the job of Esav. You see. Therefore, Yaakov and Yosef do the job of Esav. That's why it says, Uvahoyo beis Yaakov le'esh. The house of Jacob will be for a fire, ubeis Yosef lahova, and the house of Joseph will be for a flame, and therefore ubeis Esav lekash. They will be as straw. You need Yaakov and Esav. Now we begin to understand. And here comes really the best parts. Let me tell you something. You can't go in the house of Lavan if you're not prepared. So Yaakov Avinu says to himself, okay, I got to go into this, what's called Klippa, this terrible situation where the Satan is found. And that's what Lavan was. But I can't do this. With all the Torah I learned for 63 years, it's not enough. It's one thing to learn Torah when you're a tzaddik, but when you got to do battle with the Satan, you better make sure you know what you're talking about. So therefore Yaakov decides, I got to go to yeshiva. The yeshiva of Shem Ve'eva for the new job of fighting the Satan. That's why Yaakov Avinu went to the yeshiva of Shem Ve'eva for 14 years. In order to garner enough Torah to fight the Satan, as well as to understand Kedusha and spread it. Fine. So then Yaakov Avinu, he knows that he's going to have a child, a shevet, that's going to be elevated to a Chatzi Ov, half a patriarch. So therefore Yaakov, when Yosef is born, Yaakov Avinu goes running to Lavan. He says, I want to get out of here. It says, when Yosef, Vayehi, and it was, when Rachel gave birth to Yosef, then Yaakov went over to Lavan and said, I want to go back. Why when Yosef? Because Rashi says, because now that Yosef is born, let him take over the other half. I want to go back to my place. That's why it says in the Torah, you see how the Torah is one word, alludes to the whole story. So Yaakov says to Lavan, I want to go back. El mekoimi v'el artzi. To my place and to my land. What's this, my place and land? I want to go back, El artzi, to my land in Eretz Yisrael, v'el mekoimi, and to my place where I used to be spiritually, not on the side of Esav. Let Yosef do it. The language alludes to the whole concept. So therefore Yosef takes over the job of Esav, and he's a second part. Fine. If that's the case, now what happens? So Yaakov, he finishes with Lavan, because he did his job, the half a job of Esav. And Yosef is now going to do the rest. So Yaakov now goes home, and all of a sudden he meets the Satan. Why is the Satan the angel of Esav? And the answer is a very important idea. Because if you're connected to an angel and you're supposed to subdue that angel, if you do, fine. If you don't, he takes you over and he becomes your malach. Since Esav was connected to the Satan himself, not to an underling, right? Because it was a root soul patriarch against the root of all evil, because that's the only one that could subdue the Satan. Since Esav joined the Satan becomes his malach. Now, the Satan, however, is worried because Yaakov did the job. He did what? He fought, in other words, he remained righteous in the house of Lavan. Correct? So what happens? So Yaakov leaves the house of Lavan and he sends this message to Esav. He says, "In Lavan Galti, Yeshli Shor, I have an ox." Who is the ox? The ox is the sign of Mashiach ben Yosef. Listen, he tells Esav, I did the tikkun of removing the Zoyamah to the level of a patriarch. V'yeshli Chamor. Who's the Chamor? It says, V'oni Ruchel Val Chamor, that's Mashiach ben David. I brought down the root soul of Mashiach ben Yosef, that's Yosef. And I brought down the root soul of Mashiach ben David, that's Yehuda. Yeshli Shor, V'yeshli Chamor. V'yeshli Tzoin, and I have sheep, which are the 12 tribes. I brought down all these neshamas because I succeeded in doing at the level of a patriarch the incredible tikkun on both sides. And that's what he says, Im loving Garti. I lived with loving and I observed the Tarek mitzvahs. Listen, those blessings that I stole, they're only about doing the tikkun. You're not interested in tikkun. What do you care for those blessings? That was the argument that Esav said to, that Yaakov said to Esav. I observed the mitzvahs, therefore I did the job of tikkun, therefore do not hate me because I took those brachos, because they are really intended for the person that will do this tikkun. And I did it. So what complaint do you have? That's the logic of the argument of Garti. Fine. So he's now about to meet Esau. But it says, Vayira Yaakov ma'oid, that Yaakov was incredibly afraid. Why was he afraid? Because there was one mitzvah that Esau had that was incredible. That's kibbud avim. And Yaakov Avinu did not observe kibbud avim the way the other, of course, the way Esau did, because he was gone from his house for 22 years. So Yaakov was always afraid that the mitzvah of kibbud avim that Esau had, honoring your father and mother, that Esau had, would in some way subdue him. That's why he was afraid. In any case, he's about to meet Esau, but before he meets Esau, he meets the Malach. Why? Because the Satan says, you didn't finish your job of Esau. What's your job? Your unique position is you have to fight against arrogance. So it says in the Torah, a very strange story. It says Esau, the Malach of Esau, which is the Satan, and now you know why the Satan is the Malach of Esau, because that's who he had to subdue, and he failed, therefore it becomes his Malach. The Satan, the angel of death himself, he says, Yaakov, you've got one more test before I let you go. So it says in the Torah, Vaye'ovet ish imoy, and a man fought with him. What do you mean a man fought with him? It's a malach. Because what happened is it wasn't a battle. He didn't fight an angel. What he fought was the Satan as the Yitzhahara. What happened is the Satan entered his mind and said to him, wow, you're an incredible person. You just did the tikkun. You've got Klal Yisrael. You have the root soul of Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben Yosef. Wow, are you a fabulous person? Because he wanted to try to get Yaakov to be Gaiva. But the interesting thing is that since the Satan was the one in his mind, the Torah calls him an Ish because when the Satan appears to you as a Yetzirah, he's called an Ish because he's in you, therefore he comes as an Ish. But the thing is, it wasn't a mild temptation to be arrogant. It was a satanic level temptation. It means Yaakov Avinu sat the whole night trying to fight his gaiva. That's what he was doing. And at the end of the night, it's interesting. I don't want to go too much into it because it's a great deal more to say, which I have to leave out. It says that Yaakov fell slightly. It means he had a certain gaiva, slight. And because of that, the Satan was able to hit him in the side. Because he opened himself up, because there was a slight sin, and the Medrash says this, slight gaiva, and that was the opening for the Satan to hit him right by his hip. But I'm not going to go into that. But in any case, 99% Yaakov stood by the temptation of evil as given by the Satan, not an underling, and he won. And that's what it says, Vayov Yaakov Sholem, he was complete. He had brought down all the neshamas of Klal Yisrael, the shvatim, the meshichim, right? And he had done this incredible job. Fine. And now he meets Esav. Now, what did Yaakov do? He hides Dinah. What are you doing? Remember the question I said? It's probably the most single greatest question in the entire Chumash. Because what's the answer to that? I mean, if I don't marry my daughter to Carlo Gambino, he's a mafioso too. And John Gotti, you have tarumas to me? So what does this mean? Listen what the Rebbe Shalom wanted. Again, based on the hidden story. Listen to the way it works. And not only will you not have a question, you will agree with the Rebbe Shalom. That's how much you'll see what the answer is. Listen to this. The Satan has to get Yaakov at his level, which is satanic, the temptation of a Satan. Fine. So Yaakov withstands. What did Yaakov Avinu do? He subdued the Satan. Who is the Satan? The Satan is the Malach of Esav. They're still connected. Now let me ask something. Do you know that if somebody walks over to your guardian angel, and everybody has this, it's called the mazel, and I overcome him, do you know that you are incredibly changed? Because he's connected to you. In some way it alters you. If Yaakov Avinu subdued the Satan, which is the angel of Esav, what did he do? He weakened the ability of the Satan to influence Esav. Therefore, it was possible for Esav to do tshuva. Because if you weaken the Satan, the angel of Esav, his Yitzhara, so he can do tshuva. That's incredible. Esav could have done tshuva. But what do you need? What does Esav need to do tshuva? He needs a good woman. Who's that good woman? Dinah. Right? Who was Dinah? Think about it. Who was Dinah really? It says Leah had 6 kids and she was about to have a 7th. And that child was Yosef. She was going to have Yosef. So either she or Rachel prayed, and that child who was Yosef changed into a girl. Who was that girl? Dinah. So Dinah is a female Yosef, which means that she has the ability to fight the Satan. Because Yosef has the ability, which I said, to fight the Satan. So Dinah is a female Yosef. Now what a shidduch, right? A female Yosef marries Esav, who used to be the major guy that Yosef took over. Could you imagine? What a shidduch. So what would have happened? Dinah would have married Esav, right? And Dinah would have restored Esav to Klal Yisrael, because his malach was weakened. So between a weakened malach and Dinah, he would have done tshuva. What would that have meant? Esav would have become what? He would have gone back into Klal Yisrael. So therefore, for 2,000 years we suffered at the hands of Esav. All of this would have been gone because Esav would have been a Jew. Not only that, imagine what Yitzchak would have done. What kind of a simcha Yitzchak would have done had Esav restored, because Yitzchak loved Esav. That would have been an unbelievable kibbut of aim that Yaakov would have done to Yitzchak by bringing back Esav. And not only that, imagine, instead of Dinah being taken forcibly by Shem, who did they have? They had Osnas, who eventually married Yosef, because she was the one that was brought to Egypt, and Yosef married her. So Osnas would have been the daughter of Esav and Dinah, and Yosef would have married Osnas. Esav would have been the father-in-law of Yosef. What a switch! And this is what the Beresheit says. How could you do this? He's ready to do tshuva. Just give him Dinah, because he's malach. Now you're going to say to me, how is Yaakov supposed to know this? He can't read God's mind. And I'll tell you. Because first of all, he should have understood that if he subdued the Esav, he subdued the malach of Esav. But there's something else. Do you remember when I said that Esav came to kill him? He didn't.